bem-vindos e bem-vindas. Eu sou a Mariana Almeida e este é o McKinsey Talks, direto do estúdio da McKinsey em São Paulo. E eu já vou aproveitar para desejar feliz ano novo a todos, já que este é o primeiro episódio de 2022. E a gente já começa o ano com novidades. Além dos episódios regulares, o McKinsey Talks também terá séries temáticas e está ainda muito mais dinâmico. Calor e frio extremos, enchentes e desabastecimento de água, combustíveis fósseis versus fontes de energia limpas. Hoje, nós discutiremos os resultados da COP26, a Conferência da ONU sobre Mudanças Climáticas e suas implicações aqui no Brasil e também para o mundo. E este episódio será parte da série Sustentabilidade e a nova economia verde. E para falar sobre COP26, estamos aqui conectados com Daniel Pacthod, sócio da McKinsey em Nova York e líder global da prática de sustentabilidade. Ele também coordenou o programa da McKinsey junto à COP26, que reuniu cerca de 1.000 líderes mundiais. Hi, Daniel, welcome.
Hello, great seeing you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. E aqui ao meu lado no estúdio está Henrique Ceotto, sócio da McKinsey em Minas Gerais e líder da prática de sustentabilidade aqui no Brasil. Ele também liderou nossos recém-publicados estudos sobre o potencial do hidrogênio verde e do mercado de carbono no Brasil. Olá, Henrique, muito bem-vindo.
Olá, Mariana, obrigado pelo convite.
É um prazer tê-lo aqui. E hoje a nossa conversa será em inglês. Let's get started. Daniel, can you tell us what were the main outcomes from COP26?
Well, thank you, Mariana, and again, thank you for having me. COP26 was in Glasgow. I think the biggest conclusion for me is I was expecting really bad weather and a lot of rain, and actually the weather was relatively nice. So I'll start with that as a surprise. It was a very important gathering for 2 weeks, and the basis of our perspective here is we've had a chance to interact with 10,000 executives online, but also in person in Glasgow during two weeks. And then also this was the moment where we released a pretty seminal report on how to close the net zero equation. I would say there were perhaps 3 main conclusions out of COP 26. The first one is nobody is debating anymore why is this important or the what. I think everybody has reached a conclusion that it is game time when it comes to solving the climate crisis. We talk a lot about the physical risk of climate, and frankly, I think there was the realization that very little dialogue was spent on this, and the majority of the conversation was around the how and how we're going to tackle the climate crisis and how we're going to get to net zero. The second important conclusion was that, I think there was a lot of disappointment at the end of COP26 in terms of agreements between governments and nations, but it is very clear that the private sector showed up in force. And to some extent, one thing that we're seeing at McKinsey is this topic of sustainability and climate has really taken the C-suite and the boardroom by storm in the last two years. And I think it was very apparent that COP26 were representatives from the private sector globally were actually present and were frankly also meeting as industry groups to figure out, how to advance a path to net zero. The third thing that I would say, the third biggest conclusion is, the amount of capital required and the role of the financial sector. And I think several big announcements made, including by GFANZ, which is an institution that, where Mark Carney has played an important role. And the numbers that have been talked about is, $100+ trillion of capital reallocation that will be required to fund the transition to net zero. And so I think there was a clear sense that to some extent the banking sector was starting to realize, and the financial markets were really coming to the table and realizing the amount of, capital and resource reallocation that will be required. These are perhaps some of the 3 biggest takeaways for me.
Okay, thank you very much. And what is needed, Daniel, for a net zero economy and how to get there?
So, we released a report around COP26 around, how to close the net zero equation. And we said, for the engineers that are listening to us, if you were to think about getting to net zero, again, Paris-aligned targets by 2050, what are all the pluses and minuses on that equation? And I think what you realize is with almost 90% of the carbon today that is emitted is kind of covered by either companies or nations that have made commitments to net zero. And you also realize that a large number of companies have made additional commitments to either move the timeline up to 2030 or actually align with Paris-based, science-based targets. Despite all these commitments, there is really no way to close this equation and to get to 1.5 degrees, which is the warming of the planet that we were anticipating in 2050. And we did a bunch of analysis, and I think what you could argue is we're on a path that's much closer to 3 degrees or 2.5 to 3 degrees than 1.5 degrees. And so the realization is really that this equation today, despite the progress, despite all the commitment, is not closing. And in our report, we actually wrote and developed a point of view around 3 important building blocks. We talked about 9 requirements that are important to close the net zero equation. And the first one is around the physical, if you want, building blocks. And I think this is where we will need massive amount of technology innovation, of frankly scaling the supply chains on, especially on some of these low emitting, assets and energy sources. And then most importantly, also making sure there's availability of the natural resources and nature-based capital. So the first thing is there's some physical building blocks that need to be in place. The second one is there's really economic and societal adjustments that are going to be required. And I think the most important one there is really the capital reallocation that's going to be required. And, we talked about the $100 trillion plus that was mentioned in Glasgow. We actually, several days ago, released a report on the transition to net zero, which you can all look at it on McKinsey.com. And I think the title of the report is the Net Zero Transition, what it would cost and what it could bring. And in there is a very detailed analysis overall by country, by industry on, what is going to be the cost. And I think, the numbers we're talking about is $3 to $4 trillion of incremental investment per year over the next 30 years required to actually build up low emission assets. So again, second building block is really around the economic and societal adjustments. And then I think the third building block is there's a set of commitments and enabling mechanisms that are going to be really important. We talk about governing standards. We've seen a lot of movement on the sustainability accounting institutions that are coming together, and I think are also going to play an important role. We talk a lot about carbon markets and the need to actually create a carbon market to be really, the foundation for actually the net zero commitment to work. And frankly, also to manage the big gap between emerging market and developing market, and also frankly, markets that have much more exposure to fossil fuels than others. So anyway, Mariana, these are really the 3 building blocks that are important. And I think what we're realizing is you could look at this at a country level, but then you can also look at it at a company level. And I think the conversation we had in Glasgow was both, if you want, the macroeconomic view of what is going to be required, but most importantly, talking to every industry and every leadership team saying, how are you going to close the net zero equation for your company and for your industry?
Daniel, what did COP do against the requirements you mentioned, and what has happened since?
So, COP has actually, I think, created real transparency on the level of investment required. And, as we launched our transition report, I think we actually had a virtual event yesterday. Mark Carney was on it as well. And to some extent, we're in the same zip code in terms of the amount of capital required. And we also talked yesterday about the elephant in the room, which is, these are big numbers in terms of, this $3 trillion per year over 30 years. And the question that, frankly, nobody has really figured out yet is who's going to pay for it. and what's the funding that's going to be required. But I would say that, one of the things that COP26 really addressed is this need for, the transparency on the amount of resources required. The transition discussion, I don't think was really addressed at COP26. And this notion of how are we going to get to an orderly transition across, countries that will have more exposure to fossil fuels versus others. I think that's still, if you want, the big debate. And then, perhaps, Henrique, the only other thing I would say is the other thing that COP26 has really achieved, and it's less agreements that were made, it's really an increased awareness of the private sector and, frankly, leadership teams across any industry of the need to act. And, one of the terms that we love, it's a bit of a sports analogy, but, if you only play defense in your path to net zero, you're not going to be a leader of tomorrow. And I think what we've also seen is leadership teams, industry sectors, companies coming together and saying, it's as important to play defense as it is to play offense. And I think, playing offense in the world of net zero and sustainability is all about thinking about new businesses that you could build that would be, sustainable businesses or green businesses. But frankly, also how you can play a much more, if you want, forward-leaning role in this transition to net zero.
Daniel, you mentioned that we might not close the equation to reach net zero. What kind of mitigating actions should we take to get there?
So, Mariana, I think it's a great question. I would say there's two conflicting thoughts that are going through my head. The first is, I'm an optimist by heart, and I'm also a technologist by heart. And I think in one of the roundtables we had at COP26, one tech CEO said, we haven't yet taken the full power, for example, of material science engineering globally and deployed it to solve some of these unsolved problems on the net zero equation. Next gen material, new alternative proteins, new ways of producing energy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the things that's going to be required is a massive amount of technology innovation. And I do think we're a bit on the same inflection point as we were perhaps 20 or 25 years ago, when digital started. I think, a lot of my colleagues also talk about, this is another moment like the Industrial Revolution in terms of innovation, et cetera. But I do think, there's no shortage of capital. Some of the well-known private equity firms are raising significant funds. I think there's an enormous amount of capital that's flowing in some of these new technologies. But that's one of the biggest things that we need to do, which is we got to really work on the technology innovation and we talk a lot about the next gen climate technologies that will help us solve the gap. And by the way, we're so passionate about this at McKinsey that we actually are launching the McKinsey platform for climate technology, which is a bit of an open source platform where we want to really attract some amazing talent across some next gen technologies like hydrogen, carbon capture, long duration storage, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one side of answering it. I think the other side, which I think we're hearing a lot too, is mitigation. It might not be enough, and so adaptation and resilience is very important. And I think you saw it with some of the horrendous, crisis of fires, of flooding in Europe, globally. And so I think there's also the wake-up call that on one hand, we got to work on closing the net zero equation, but at the same time, we got to also build up the climate resilience and be ready for more climate crisis. And I think that's also a thread that frankly happens at the country level. But I've also had this conversation with a lot of global companies looking at their risk profile and starting to build in a lot more resilience around climate.
What are the implications for leaders and what they should be thinking about and doing?
So, I've had the pleasure in the last year of speaking to a lot of leadership teams globally across different industry sectors on this topic. And I think this is time for leadership with a big L, if I can say it this way, I think this is a topic where I think leaders who are jumping in the arena, who are embracing the need for action and who are playing offense, are going to come out of this transition ahead of their peers in any industry sector. And so I think, and I think what I've heard a CEO mention to me last week is, the CEO is the Chief Sustainability Officer. There is no way you can outsource this to a team on the side or just have a chapter in your annual report that talks about sustainability. You got to get, in the arenas, you got to get your fingernails dirty, and you got to really start working this aggressively. So that's the first mindset that I think is important. I think there's a playbook, Henrique, emerging. The playbook is different across industries. If you're in hard-to-abate sectors, which, by the way, another big conclusion at COP26 was that we are going to have to work in these hard-to-abate sectors. We collectively have to really help take these hard-to-abate sectors to net zero. Otherwise, we're not going to meet the net zero aspirations by 2050. And if you're in the hard-to-abate sectors, there might be some assets that have a level of carbon intensity that you can just not fix. And so you will have to retire them. I think there's a set of assets that you will have to decarbonize. And I think there's real work that happens there. And I think it's been very interesting to see how some oil and gas or some chemical companies have really taken the bull by the horn on this and are really starting to move in the right direction. While you do that, you have to build new green businesses. One of the best questions I've heard a leader ask his leadership team is, if we were to clean sheet our company today for sustainability, what would our company look like if we were to take our brands, our distribution, our leadership team, our history, and if we were to just build it with as much capital as you want, what would it look like? And I think in that conversation, we came up with 4 or 5 ideas of new businesses to build that, frankly, the team hadn't really thought about. And so you got to think really about not only decarbonizing the core, but also building the new. You have to do both at the same time. I think there's another piece, another part of the playbook, which is nature-based solutions and offsets, which is really important. And I do think, countries like Brazil will actually play a really important role in that. We talked about the importance of carbon pricing and carbon markets. And frankly, as any company, you got to be in the mix there and really understand how it works. And then finally, there's something around, capability building and having your narrative. And so I think making sure that your leadership team and you as a leader are conversant on sustainability. And then you really have to own the narrative. And the narrative is an internal narrative. It's a narrative with stakeholders, multi-stakeholders. And I think it's also a narrative with investors, which is, how are you taking this on and how is this going to create value for investors? We, in the latest report we just released on the transition, we have a detailed analysis on job created and destroyed. And to some extent, when you look at the capital that's going to be deployed, if you think about a certain return on capital, there's an enormous amount of value that's going to be created here. And I think so that's also going to be a bit the thinking you have to take.
Thank you, Daniel. You just mentioned a little bit about Brazil and its role, but Henrique, what do you think? How would you translate in a little bit of details our discussion into implications for Brazil? Would you detail a little bit more?
Sure. First of all, I think it's a massive opportunity for the country, right? Many of our supply chains are among the cleanest in the world. So our exports can actually help a lot of countries decarbonize much cheaper and much more efficiently than these countries doing them by themselves. Second, the green resources we have, it's pretty amazing, right? This goes from the clean energy we can produce with solar energy, hydro. We actually have the largest carbon capture potential through what Daniel referred to as natural-based solutions. And while many countries are struggling to become carbon neutral, Brazil is actually one of the few countries that may become carbon negative.
So, Henrique, can you provide us a few specific examples?
My pleasure. To start with, we can, for example, take the flat steel value chain, right? Brazil produces steel emitting about 1.6 tons of CO2 per ton of steel. That's about 25% lower than the global average, which is 2.2. So we're already cleaner in that aspect, right? But that doesn't end there, right? We have a massive opportunity to export low carbon metallics through leveraging technologies that are based on biomass, like what Techno had from Vale, or using green hydrogen to do direct reduction of iron and export a clean metallic worldwide. The opportunity, just to give you an example, if you go to Europe and you take the 2030 commitments of industrial companies that use steel as raw materials, they would need by 2030 65 million tons of low carbon steel. All the capacity that is being built to fulfill that demand accounts for about half of that. We can have a major role in providing the other half. That's a 35 million ton opportunity. That's 50% of the market for green steel in Europe, right? Another great opportunity is just green hydrogen, right? Green hydrogen is a carrier of energy. It allows for energy to be transferred long distance when you cannot have transmission line, so like over the ocean, for example, right? And 70% of the cost of hydrogen comes from energy. And Brazil is one of the cheapest countries to produce clean energy. So we have, and that comes from the fact that not only we have a lot of wind and a lot of solar, but we also have complementarity between those sources. So the actual capex required to produce hydrogen is much lower. So I get the cheap energy, I get lower capex, so I get this massive opportunity to export and to produce and to provide the world with clean energy. And finally, and I want to come back to the point that Daniel mentioned about the potential for Brazil to help with the offset markets, right? Brazil can be the leader in that market. Our natural-based offsets can account for about 2 gigatons, right? One coming from just protection of forests. We emit from our emissions, 1 gigaton comes from deforestation. And you can actually issue preservation credits on that. And that's if you take the numbers from the Leaf Coalition, for example, that can account for a $20 billion market, right? On the flip side, we also can reforest, and we can use our agricultural industry to capture carbon in the soil. And that accounts for another gigaton. And those credits are much more valuable because they're actually offsetting instead of just lowering emissions. And if you take some of the projections we're seeing, and that can come to about $50 per ton by 2030, we're talking about another 50 billion opportunity for Brazil, right? So these numbers are massive, and we have truly an opportunity to move forward and lead this transition to the green economy.
We are coming to the end of our session. Daniel, what would you like our audience to remember from this conversation?
So, Mariana, first of all, I share the excitement here that Henrique conveyed about the opportunities for Brazil and Latin America. I might try to synthesize it around 3 things that I'd love the audience to remember. The first, if you're a leader of a private company, of a public sector company, of an NGO, you got to get into the net zero arena. It's time for action. You got to get in there. Point number 1. Point number 2, playing defense is not going to cut it. You have to play offense. And so I would really encourage every leader to step back and say, if I have to rebuild what I do today based on sustainability, what would that look like? What are the new businesses I can actually build? Frankly, what are the new people I could attract to actually go after these endeavors? And then, the third message in my mind is technology and climate technology innovation. I think we are just getting started, and I think we will have a massive wave of innovation. I think Brazil and Latin America can play a really important role there.
Great. Henrique, would you like to add anything?
No, hard to beat that closing, but I just want to reinforce the opportunity for the country, right? It's massive. It's, probably over $100 billion opportunity. If we compare to some of our exports like meat, that's probably 10 times, 20 times more than what we do. So it's really, really massive. And a lot of this money will go through social challenged areas because a lot of our resources are in those areas, right? So, for example, the Amazon basin, right, or the northeast of Brazil. So this actually can help us not only with the economy of Brazil, but also making it a more balanced economy for all.
Sustainable and inclusive growth.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. Great. So thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you so much, Henrique. It was a very interesting conversation. Muito obrigada a vocês também que nos acompanharam de casa em vídeo ou então em podcast. E se você quiser saber mais sobre a COP26 e a economia verde, ou também entrar em contato com os nossos especialistas, o nosso e-mail é mckinsey-talks@mckinsey.com. E você também pode enviar perguntas para o nosso próximo episódio desta série, que será sobre hidrogênio verde e o seu potencial aqui no Brasil. Participe! Para conhecer a agenda completa do McKinsey Talks, acesse mckinseytalks.com. E lá você pode conferir este episódio e também os anteriores. É isso aí, muito obrigada e até a próxima!